Good day and welcome to Vision 2020. My name is Michael Kent, and in this session, we'll be looking at modernizing your change process. Depending on what IT management frameworks or IT processes you may have, you may already have implemented some parts of what we'll discuss. In any event, use the shopping cart method here. Take what you need and feel free to leave the rest. Change management is the IT practice designed to minimize disruptions to IT services while making changes to critical systems and services. Of course, a change is adding, modifying, or removing anything that could have a direct or indirect effect on those services. Change management practices are designed to reduce incidents and meet regulatory standards. The practice ensures efficient and prompt handling of changes to IT infrastructure and code. Whether you're rolling out new services, managing existing ones, or resolving problems in code, modern change management approaches break down silos, provide context, transparency, avoid bottlenecks, and minimize risk. Now, what we know is that change is a constant. And those of us that have been doing this for a while have learned that not all changes are the same. Even if a change looks the same, it's probably not, because the underlying conditions of those systems involved have already changed, either through our processes or through some other process that used them as a dependency. So in reality, change is not only a constant, change is constant. Most organizations started with IT management with a framework called ITIL. ITIL defined the change types and matched the processes to manage risk based on those change types. Of course, the world has changed quite a bit since the initial popular adoption of ITIL. As such, let's take a quick look at their most recent guidance on those change types. The standard change is any change that is straightforward, happens frequently, where documentation is needed and no authorizations, specifically by a CAB, which is your Change Advisory Board. Next, we have normal changes, important. They do require a full review, requires CAB and authorization. And so this is just the CAB team, a subset of individuals to take a look at the risk and assess any potential impact. Then we have our major changes, high risk changes. You need detailed reporting for high risk changes. It does require Change Advisory Board approval and management authorization. So this is something bigger, it's going to have a bigger impact, and ultimately you don't want your CIO or your C-levels coming to you and saying, what happened and why didn't I know about it? And then finally, there's the emergency, right? Urgent, resolves an incident, critical failure, replacing equipment, etc. There's a high risk of failure because it is happening with urgency. And here you usually have a flexible pool of approvers because the goal is to get the service back online, right? So these are the updated change types. What I really want to hone in on and focus in on is the standard change type and the normal change type. Now, whether you use ITIL or have gone full DevOps, use another framework or anything in between, we can use these to level set some of the guidance that we're presenting here today. Here we see a couple of other keywords that I want to point out as well. We see authorizations. In modern terminology, you'll see those referred to as change authority. These are the approvers. We'll talk about how we want to push those change approvers and rescope what they're looking at to keep them closer to the change and closer to the subject of the change, right? What we don't want is change approvers that are from finance and you're talking about an IT change and they have no understanding of what that means. And we also see that we have that change advisory board. We're going to talk about that in a minute as well. The key here is if we can modernize our change process and move our changes toward the standard and normal, we can move through these processes faster while still meeting the objectives of change management as a practice. The goal here, of course, would be to craft our change process to shift as many of our changes, which could be upward of 70%, to standard. This sets us up later for automation. So how do we modernize this change process? What does it mean? Let's start with what I like to call the big rocks. These are the big ideas to discuss. Then we'll look at some practical steps. One of the big rocks I'll discuss here today is reframing change as an experience, thinking of change as an end-to-end experience and not an event. This allows us to effectively create a journey, and more importantly, a journey in context, a journey that you'll take users through again and again and again, right? So instead of, oh, stop, here's another alert, we have to apply this change, update, Windows update, what have you, can we create a story where they're expecting these changes, where these changes are part of their normal existence, their end-to-end experience? Can we minimize the impact of those changes, especially if we're moving toward standard changes, so that it slipstreams and the user is just not aware, right? They log off today, they come in tomorrow, the change is already there. They didn't even see it. This is one of the concepts that we'll talk about in order to modernize that change. The other is the approach around centered in human context, right? So as we put together this story, how is a change going to move through our environment? What does that mean to the application owner? What does that mean to the application user? What does that mean to the individual performing the change, right? If the application owner has it easy, the infrastructure folks have a really tough time, and then the end user has service interruption, we need a better story. So can we pull those human contexts into that story and make sure that we're making our change process take that change through these in a way that really brings the humans back into that equation? We'll talk about a little bit what that means. That might be peer review. That might be having internal tracks in Slack or Teams that allow for easier approval, right? Real-time interaction versus we all get together in a meeting and discuss what's going to happen. It might be live documentation. These are ideas around taking an approach that is centered around humans in context. What are the things that you look at and interact with every day? And can I weave this change process into those, bring them into your view without a great deal of upheaval, not just for the end user, but for everyone involved in the process. So 5 steps toward modernizing your change process. It'd be great if we were all just DevOps, but we're not. And even if you are DevOps, you still have to answer risk tolerance and regulatory obligations. So we need to know those. What do we have to account for when we design these processes? What kind of reporting? And ultimately, from a risk tolerance perspective, can we lower that risk impact? Can we better work with regulatory obligations through auditing or surfacing of data that will ease those transitions? Can we simplify and automate the change process wherever possible? We're going to dig into that one as well. One of the items on here is to reconceive your change advisory board. Instead of being traditionally seen as a bottleneck, um, a process hurdle, the place where everyone says no, asks a million questions, doesn't really understand what's happening, and may or may not be paying attention in the meeting. Can we reconceive that CAB, make them strategic advisors? Can we present the CAB as something wholesale different? And we'll look at that a little bit here in a minute. And then finally, embrace practices that make standard changes the new normal change, right? Finally, well, what I would say is when you look at your frameworks, your ITIL, your DevOps, they're meant to be guides, not rigid rules. There is no math, there is no formula that will absolutely predict success. And anything generic needs to be made specific in order for it to really work for your environment. So let's look at simplifying and automating that change process. First thing we would want to do is take a look at our recent changes. What were the most common changes? Which changes are standard changes today? What services do they impact? Are there services that are harder to modernize than others? Which changes were successful? What was the average time to implement these changes? And which changes were requested by development teams? Once we've collected that data, we can start looking at the automation. So for automating those changes, we'll select 3 to 5 standard changes as a way to get started. What are our candidates from the pool above? Let's build out self-service requests for those standard changes in your service management software, whatever that might be. Let's capture those important fields, system, application, and service that's being changed. We're going to use this data later to answer these questions when we cycle back through, when we iterate back over and look for the next set of changes that we want to automate. And then we create automation rules that auto-approve the change. Now, when we talk about automation rules, we're talking about workflow, right? That auto-approve the change, the transition statuses, and notify the staff of updates. This is where you want to look at integrations. Can I integrate the systems involved, my change management tools, my ITSM tools, my DevOps tools, to automate this process for standard changes and send notifications along the way? Again, in that human context, if I can notify you through a chatbot, your change is going live in 3, 2, 1, here you go, and let people immediately get in there and test and understand whether it's working or not working, get you feedback so that you can move on to either other changes or progressive deployments. And then finally, monitor that performance over the next few months. Because again, we're going to take that data and mine that data for the next 3 to 5 candidates that we want to automate. Let's talk about reconceiving the change advisory board. Traditionally, the change advisory board was seen as a necessary evil, I guess, from most infrastructure perspectives. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can reposition the CAB as a strategic advisor. Decentralize the change authority toward business stakeholders and peer review level for approvals. So if we look at our change types, a standard change needs no authorizations by the CAB, only the stakeholders. So if your application owner, your business owner, and your business user all agree, pardon me, then we're good to go. We don't have to wait for a week or twice a week, get into a meeting, review things that are just going to be rubber stamped for approval. And then the last idea is to restrict the CAB meetings and scope to only the most important changes, the highest risk changes. So even though a normal change in ITIL's view does require CAB authorization, can we pull that out? Can we say, well, by implementing automation or by implementing some other testing methodologies or UAT, can we reduce the scope, reduce the risk, break up the deployment so that it doesn't have such a high impact, and thus take the change advisory board out of the equation? Of course, for major and emergency risks, you'd want a flexible pool of approvers or management authorization. But here again, if we can focus in on standard and normal changes and remove the cab from that process, we can automate those processes and modernize our change management. Encouraging standard changes. One idea that I'll present is this concept of a you build it, you run it approach. And this is to say for an application team and an application owner, if they're DevOps, if they understand their team, their stakeholders, they've already started committing their code through continuous integration, they deploy their code with continuous deployment, have them run the process, right? So let's democratize the change process. Let's give these folks that adhere to our guidelines a fast lane where they can run the change themselves, get the feedback, report the feedback to you, either through integrated systems, apply those changes. And this helps keep those teams engaged with their customers' journey and not just it works on my machine, not just the application, right? If our teams that build our changes are the teams that have to live with those changes, the changes will be better. This also allows for approvals at the business stakeholder level, right? So they are the reason for a lot of these changes. It's important that their fingerprints are on the change and that they're managing those expectations. And it also aligns with CI/CD and DevOps practices. I would encourage those app owners to take a design thinking approach, right, where they really empathize with their user and what they have to go through. Define what that change has to be. Ideate, prototype, and test. The prototyping and testing are important here because that is what will allow feedback loops that will make the changes better, but also allow the change process to mature. What we see here is that there are new pressures that are being placed on existing change processes. And these pressures are infinite. If our change process doesn't modernize, we're going to get overwhelmed, right? So some of these concepts that Agile brings forward, right? Smaller changes, more frequent changes, deployed more often. That's more change. Continuous deployment, right? If we want to be able to support continuous deployment, we have to automate those changes. We have to move them towards standard changes, and we have to minimize the effect through ring deployments and what have you. And then finally, we're developing code, we're making these changes. Information technology as a unit is here to support the business and the business needs. Time to market is a critical business success factor. If our processes are slow, if we can't get changes to our customers or to our teams that support our customers fast enough, someone else beats us to the customer and wins the business. We also know that cloud is really putting new pressures on the change process and the people involved. It's in a rapidly evolving technology. There's a lot of change in just the technology stacks. They're complex stacks. They're complex stacks that you lose some control over, right? So you don't have control over some of the networking, the brokerage, load balancing, of cloud. That's the good and the bad of it. So those processes, those technologies are changing, and you just have to deal with the result of the change. They're dynamic environments, right? They might auto scale. How does that impact your change process? If you have a service that is designed to auto scale and it starts building additional units for burstable capacity, what does that change process look like? And does the whole process account for the dynamic reporting that would be required for compliance, um, for management, for cost, what have you? And then service changes, right? So cloud has new instance types, regions, locations, um, 200 plus services that are all on their own roadmap and all produce their own changes at a rapid pace. Finally, your change process now has to account for this anywhere, anytime work. This is onshoring, offshoring, and nearshoring. Follow the clock, round the clock, follow the sun coverage. Work from home where your employees and your customers are ultimately shifting their schedules. Some work in the morning, some find it easier to work in the evening. Your change windows have diminished, and higher customer expectations and demand. Uh, People are used to getting their software faster, getting an update on their phone. Um, they're used to this rapid pace of features coming to their phone, um, and they have a high expectation that that'll work seamless, that the integration will, from a intuitive perspective, make sense with very little change in their behavior. This is what's being delivered through mobile devices. This is what's being delivered in all the new web-first technologies that they're interacting with today. Um, this creates a perception and an expectation. Do your change processes help deliver to those demands and expectations? Thank you. Uh, Hopefully you've found one or two things you can take away and implement today. Some larger thought items that you can discuss with your team and see about implementing. Uh, Ultimately, as you move toward automation, as you move toward these different environments, and moving that change through those environments faster, remember to keep your users in mind. Remember that human context. If you can design a process, a modern process that speaks to them where they are and um, delivers on their expectations, you can modernize your process and tremendously accelerate the rate of change. And as we've seen, the changes are coming faster and faster than they ever have before. Thank you. Have a great